Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the last horror-related game on the month of October, and I decided to pick something that is not really like super obscure. It's more or less one of those games that has gained quite a following over the years, and that happens to be Haunting Ground, which is another survival horror style game done by Capcom, and it was even published by them as well. And it was released in all regions in the year 2005. And interestingly enough, this game is considered as a spiritual successor to Clock Tower, which, by the way, the last Clock Tower game that they made before this one was also done by Capcom, and that was Clock Tower 3 in 2002. So I'm sure most people associate Capcom with a survival horror game, they usually think of Resident Evil. Well, this one actually is a lot different than that. In fact, like I said, it's actually very similar to Clock Tower. So without further ado, let's just begin with talking about the story. So the main character that you play as is Fiona Bell. And as soon as she wakes up, she just ever so happens to be in a cage that was left unlocked for some whatever reason. So she happens to get out of there and she happens to be stuck inside a mysterious castle. And eventually finding a bedroom, she happens to see someone else, and that happens to be Daniela, who is the maid of the castle. Now, despite her sounding really bored and tired of everything, she still happens to do the typical maid stuff. In fact, the first thing that she does for you is that she gives you a set of clothing, because you don't want her to start wandering around in a creepy castle wearing nothing but a towel. Okay, well, maybe you do if you're one of those individual people, but, that's besides the point. And after getting your new clothes, Daniela disappears for a while, and then you eventually find a giant guy named Debititas, or Debidadas, or I don't fucking remember how it's pronounced. But anyways, I'm pretty sure you know exactly which person I'm talking about. He is the giant groundskeeper who happens to be mentally disabled. In fact, he is the first person that starts chasing you around all over the castle because he thinks of you as a giant toy for him to play with. Yeah, the one thing I do like about the idea of this character is that he's not so much like an evil stalker who's just trying to kill you, it's more the fact that he's just misunderstood. So after getting away from him, you end up going into a room where you hear a mysterious voice that happens to come from a guy named Ricardo. And he tells a little bit of backstory behind how Fiona got here, because apparently her and her parents were in a car crash, and whenever the car crash happened, she was the only one to survive it, and she just happens to get wound up all the way into this mysterious castle. And after getting really shocked, dazed and confused by all this new information that she absorbed, she happens to faint and pass out right into the bed of the guest room where she once was before. And before continuing on with exploring through the castle, she happens to hear something really weird outside, and that happens to be a dog that was tied up to a tree, which is just, really fucked up. So after she gets the dog out of the contraption, which kind of reminds me of Resident Evil 4 when you had the wolf that would get stuck in the bear trap. So she tells the dog to leave this hellhole because, it's no place for dogs, but the dog doesn't listen and ends up wanting to be with her since the dog life was saved, and therefore that's all I'm going to explain for the story, where that's pretty much the starting of what you need to know for basic stuff. But before I move on with the gameplay, one thing you gotta know is that no, Groundskeeper DDD is not the only enemy throughout the entire game. So I'll give away something that I don't really consider a spoiler. So eventually after when you defeat him and he happens to apologize to you and never come out of his shack, so the next person that's trying to stalk and kill you happens to be Daniela, who eventually goes crazy because she is uber jealous of you having something called the Azov. Now, in case you're wondering what the hell's the Azov, well, the easiest way to explain it is that it's essentially the Philosopher's Stone of the game. And she just happens to go batshit crazy, much like a Danganronpa character. So to sum it all up, you're getting chased by multiple characters, for they have their own reasons for chasing after you and scaring the piss out of you. But it's only you that they care about. They don't care about the dog for some whatever reason, even though he is clearly helping you. But yeah, anyways, with that being said, now let's get moving on and start talking about the gameplay. So just like I mentioned in the two other reviews for this month, being Galarians and Athena Awakening from the Ordinary Life, this game is not all that different, at least when it comes to the main concepts. So, wandering around, doing puzzles, reading notes, and picking up items, and also finding some equipment and all that kind of good stuff. So, the typical good stuff that goes into a survival horror. But the one thing that is different with this one is that you can't really go around killing everything in sight because you don't really get any weapons. The only type of attack that you have is a kick. And the only thing it can kill is jars that you just find laying around that could have items in them. But if you try kicking some of the stalkers that chase after you, it will only stun them for a short time. But of course, it is not very effective. Probably the best ways to defend yourself in this game is by using some of the items that there are some that you can throw at the enemy and it'll stun them, or there are some that where you can plant them onto the ground, and if they happen to walk over them, then they get stunned. So it kinda has a little bit of a deception vibe to it, but just not nearly as over the top, but hey, that's still pretty awesome though. And the other thing that is very noteworthy with this game is controlling the dog Huey. So sometimes when you're being chased, you can actually tell the dog to go bite the other person's hand, and they'll get stuck for a bit. And the dog will sometimes find items for you that you can't normally see. And he can also detect if either certain enemies are close by, or if there's a trap nearby. And it's also good to give him some attention whenever he needs to, because there are going to be times that if you don't give him enough attention, he won't do exactly what you tell him to do. So like a real dog, he can be very loyal to you. In fact, he's probably even more loyal to you than the boy in his blob. So the only way that you can really get away from some of these stalkers is that you have to hide somewhere. And there's many different hiding spots you can go to, like there's hiding underneath beds, you can also hide in the closets, and there you can even hide behind doors or kneeling behind certain objects. And you really gotta be smart about hiding, because if you try to hide in the same room that the stalker is in, then he's gonna see you right away and is gonna try to murder you. So that's why you really gotta be deceptive and also run away as fast as you can. But then there's gonna be that time where you can go into panic mode. So there are many things that could cause the panic mode to happen, where, sometimes it could be getting hit a certain amount of times, or it could be if you're running way too much when you're running away from the enemies, and even interacting with certain objects that could freak your character out. And usually the screen will go really trippy and all wavy-like, although not as trippy as something like Eternal Darkness, but pretty trippy enough, and then of course your character will start running on her own, and she'll start bumping into walls, or sometimes she'll kinda fall over. And the worst case scenario is that sometimes Fiona will fall over and freeze while she's on the ground, leaving you wide open to get murdered. But you can easily see it coming whenever you are going to head into panic mode, so you do get items like lavender that can help calm you down. So the next thing we're going to be mentioning here is the Valiato Machina, where basically it's an alchemy machine where you get to create new items. So usually you'll find certain items that are specifically used for crafting, and I'll be quite honest, using this crafting thing is easier said than done, or at least for me, because I fucking suck at this. So you gotta line up certain colored balls, and depending on which one you get will create a certain item representing of whatever the hell it is. But the one thing that really makes it hard is the fact that getting the timing on that is just really difficult, because it goes by super quickly, and your response has to be 100% accurate. If you're even a millisecond off, then you could fuck it up. And to make matters worse, if you let it scroll around a certain amount of times, then, yeah, it's just gonna go to nothing. Yeah, I had a real hard time with this, especially later on in the game, where the game got really difficult because I didn't have a certain amount of items that I couldn't make. And now, one last thing to mention about the gameplay has to do with the puzzles. Now, yes, the puzzles within this game are pretty easy stuff to understand. You gotta find certain keys or certain items, you gotta place them in the right spot, all that kind of stuff that we've all done before. But one thing that does make some of the puzzles in this game a little bit tricky is that there's actually a typewriter that you can use in this game, and no, it does not allow you to save your game. That's what the clocks are used for. So what you use the typewriter for is that it allows you to make plate keys with certain words on them, and you gotta actually put out the word that you need to put it out with certain puzzles. I have to say, some of these are pretty hard to figure out on your own, because there are certain things I was like, oh, I never would have thought that I'd have to, type in the word, salt into the thing and put it into, this thing. And you only get a limited amount of them, so you don't want to start bullshitting around and start putting in things like balls and peanuts and all that kind of goofy shit. But other than the mandatory puzzles, you can also use some of the plate keys and typing in certain words, and you can use them to get bonus items and whatnot. So there is some little things that you can find with that, which is pretty interesting. So that takes care of the basic stuff you need to know about the gameplay, so now let's take a look at the game's controls. And the controls in this one are really good. So everything is really responsive, also the button layout is very easy to figure out. So you command the dog with the right analog stick, and depending on the direction that you take, it will tell what the dog to do. And then there's kicking, throwing things when you have something equipped, and then there's a quick back step, and holding down a button to run. In fact, one weird thing about this game is that you actually don't use L2 and R2, which I thought was a little strange, but even without using those, this game still does play really well when it comes to the button layout. And like I said, the response time on them are also really good, and I don't have any complaints about that. And one thing that is interesting about the walking in this game is that there's actually no tank controls in this game. So for the people out there that hate tank controls from the older games, then at least this is going to be one game I think you wouldn't have any issues with. And even though I've said it many times that I don't mind tank controls in survival horror games, I also don't really mind it being like this either. I still think the game is still really creepy as it is. So with that being said, the controls in this one are really good and I don't have much complaints about them whatsoever. But before we move on, one good thing that I do want to mention, and I thought was pretty impressive for PS2 standards, is the fact that whenever you go from one room to another room, there's like no loading whatsoever. The game is runs as quick as butter, if that even makes sense. But yeah, no, this game actually runs really quickly. So now, let's start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And the graphics in this one are really fucking good. So obviously, because this is a horror game, the game looks very dark and gritty, which of course, it suits the game perfectly. But I really love the style that they picked for the game because it has a really dark goth setting to it, which I think looks really beautiful looking. Because not only is the castle very gothic looking in some of the rooms, but even the character designs also look very gothic like. And speaking of characters, a lot of people kept on saying how this game portrays women very sexually because, you know, the way how Fiona is dressed. Now, I don't want to get too much into this whole, rant thing there, but all I gotta say is that she's not that provocative. I mean, sure, the skirt is very short-looking, and therefore it shows her sexy thighs, but, you know, it's not, the most provocative thing ever. But even with that, I still find that her character design is still done pretty well, and just like the rest of the characters. But probably the most impressive thing about this game graphically is the opening cutscene looks almost like an early PS3 game with that amount of detail for PS2, holy shit. So yeah, I don't have any complaints whatsoever when it comes to the graphics. I think this is just a really beautiful, dark, gothic looking game that is just really fantastic looking. And it also has a lot of creepy looking areas too, just for one example, this room with all the marionettes pinned down to the wall. That shit's fucking creepy as shit, man. And there are many other ones out there, but that one is probably one of the most memorable ones in my opinion. So yeah, don't have much complaints about the graphics. It's definitely a powerhouse for PS2 standards. And now, as for the game's music, the game's soundtrack is really good and does fit with the game, which, you know, has a lot of creepy atmospheric stuff. It also has a lot of songs that do sound really intense with the game. But as great as the soundtrack for this game is, unfortunately, it's one of those soundtracks where it only sounds really good with the game. If you try to listen to it outside of the game, it's just not the same. Not to say that it's bad, it's just, you know, there's no real catchy tunes that get stuck in your head or anything like that. Just to make another comparison to another Capcom game, it's not like Mega Man, where the music in that game is fucking awesome. You can just listen to it not only within the game, but also on your iPod or your phone or whatever. So overall, for the music in the game, it does sound really awesome within the game, but it's not something I would listen to outside of it, but that doesn't mean it's a bad OST. So I still think it is a really good one to have. So now, as for the game's voice acting, I find that the voice acting is kind of alright. It's not really great, but it's not really bad either, but it does kind of fit with the game, at least for some of the characters. So Fiona is being played by Cornelia Hayes, and I'm not really too familiar with her, but I do find that she did do a pretty decent job as her. And then Daniela is being played by Moria Quirk. Now, I think she did do an okay job as her. Now, yeah, her voice sounds pretty fucking, like, bland and boring, but, I think it does kind of suit with her character, since her personality is very dull and cold to everything, so, yeah, for some reason it kind of works for how weird it is. And then Ricardo is being played by Greg Ellis. This is another one where I actually thought it was pretty decent. In fact, one thing that I actually known him from is that he actually plays Cat Sith from Degree of Cerberus, so that's pretty amusing. And the final one that I want to touch base on here is Groundskeeper DDD, who is being played by Lex Lang, if you could believe it. And I think he did do a good job with this one, since, he does sound pretty, like, crazy and all that kind of shit. And I never would have guessed that Lex Lang played him, so at least that was kind of a fun surprise. So yeah, the voice acting here isn't anything amazing, but I wouldn't say it's anything terrible either. I'd say it's just decent at best, and you know what? That's okay to have. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, well, if you're living in North America, this one is unfortunately a very tough one to come by for many reasons. So the first thing I gotta say is that the average prices that I've seen this game go for is like $100, $120. I've even seen one going for $150, if you could believe it. So usually between the $100 to $150 range. So yeah, this game is pretty expensive. And you know what? Funny story I want to mention here is that I remember back in 2007, I actually saw a copy of this game at the EV Games around my area back when they still had used PS2 games for $14.99. And I didn't get it because I was like, oh, I'm gonna go back and get this next time I come back. And guess what? The game disappeared and I haven't seen it for many, many years until this year when I actually found a copy of it where I ended up trading in a bunch of crap that I wasn't playing. So I thought it was worth it for that, since this was a game that has been a long time coming for me. But it really is unfortunate that the North American version of the game is very expensive, because apparently the PAL version of the game is not nearly as much. I find this is one of those games that the PAL region got super lucky on. And to make things worse is that this game is just not a very easy access game, since it never got released on PS3's PSN. Actually, it did, but it was only in Japan. Well, there's another reason why we can call Capcom Crapcom. Well, anyways, if you at least do want to play the game on emulation without having to pay some of the ridiculous prices, at least it is doable. So you really just gotta mess around with some of the settings with like hardware mode and software mode and all that kind of crap. There's actually some instructions on how to set it up properly, thank fuck. And as expected, for PS2 emulation, you gotta have a good enough PC to do it. So yeah, this is one of those games that I really wish was on the PS2 section on PS4's PSN. Even though I already own a copy of it now, it still would be nice for the people that don't want to pay some of the ridiculous prices, that just want to, simply just play the game, since, that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to enjoy fucking gaming. But anyways, now let's get moving on to my overall thoughts on this game, and all I gotta say is that this is actually a pretty great horror game, but as great as it is, I'm not 100% sure if I put it up there with, like, the classic stuff with, like, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and hell, I'd even put Fatal Frame up there. But I do find that the game's concept really shines throughout, since it's all about playing as a chick that can't really defend herself properly, so you gotta use a dog to help you out. And you just gotta make sure you don't go insane. Also, the game's story in general, I thought was really interesting, even though there were some parts that were pretty, like, typical horror stuff, but, I thought it was actually pretty well written. And the other thing that I had also put up there, some of the best parts of the game, would have to be the graphics, because, man, this is, like, one of the best looking PS2 games I've seen in quite a while. Not only for art direction, but also for textures and such. So, with that being said, I do find that Haunting Ground is a really good survival horror that I do think is worth checking out if you are a fan of horror games. But because the game is not easy access, it is unfortunate that not many people will have a chance of playing this game, since most people don't want to pay over $100 for a used PS2 game, which is very understandable. So at this point, I don't think it matters how you play the game, whether you're playing a physical copy or an emulated version, or hell, even if you're playing the PSN version in Japan. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you're playing the game, you're doing it right. So that sums up my thoughts on this game. I do think this is a really good one to check out if you can. And that'll be all for the horror-themed games for this month of October, so I hope everyone has a great Halloween this year, and I also hope everyone else is having a good time playing some horror-related video games and watching some horror movies and all that fun shit. So yeah, I'm gonna end it right here, so thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.